I'm Bryan Cranston, and you're listening to the Pantheon Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 5 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. It's a down and dirty season. We're getting down and dirty yet again. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to see a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, if you're tired of the wonderful fashion that I am sporting every single episode, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre and you can just listen. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast. Desperately need your support. I'd like to expand and do so much else this season. I do have some great things in store, by the way, including this episode. And I'm going to get to the title right away and then all the other crapola. The topic for this episode, it is the 34th installment of Music is Everything, my opinion podcast, where I don't tie it to one specific kind of music or artist or song or album or anything like that. Music is Everything number 34, and the title is Ear Glamor. Audiophiles kind of suck. So we're going to get to what that means and all that stuff. But first, a quick note about my new sponsor this season, Qobuz. It's a music streaming platform about the same price as Spotify or Apple per month. It has over 100 million tracks, all high res. If you know anything about audio, most of what you're hearing on Spotify and Apple, MP3s, compressed. It's fine, not great. Something like Qobuz, high res, wave, AIFF maybe, I don't even know, but I know that the quality is better. And it also includes editorial content, liner notes, interviews, and more. It takes what I call a boutique record shop approach to music. So if you miss the days of CDs, cassettes, and vinyl, where you get to sift through the lyrics and the cover art and all that stuff and the inside art, Qobuz is for you. It's on iOS and Android. All right, so enough of the hawking. So why am I doing an episode on Audiophiles? Well, it's pretty simple. I make a list of topics and often last minute decide what I am going to cover based on how it moves me. And this topic has been moving me for a very long time. I am conflicted about so-called optimal sound quality. I understand that there are degrees of sound quality, and yet at the same time, I'm not sure how much I care. And it's when I realized that this internal conflict I have is about external perceptions, specifically as a music creator, constantly worrying about whether or not your mix is perfect or your mastering is perfect or the way you record it is perfect and how will people perceive it and how will it measure up against other recordings. I need to tell all of you that all of that is bullshit. And that if you have some base level of knowledge and experience in recording and mixing and mastering and all that stuff, you're enough in the ballpark that your music will do well. So that's part of why I'm doing this, to really dispel the myth that there, A, is perfection of any sort, or that if you achieve this Valhalla of optimal sound quality that audiophiles love, that it will somehow make your music better received, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to talk a lot more about artists and how the audiophile attitude relates to artists, but I'm also going to talk about listeners in particular, because when you think of an audiophile, you most often think of listeners. You most often think of people who like vinyl, although that predates that. And the reason why I called it ear glamour is because, like people who judge others based on looks, audiophiles tend to judge music based on their perceived judgment of the sound quality and not the music itself. They often care less about the substance of the music than they do about how it was recorded, what system it's on, what format you're listening to, the environment that you're listening in, and all those are valid. but are they more important than the music? And do audiophiles have a point? So part of what I'm going to do here is truly do the pros and cons of being an audiophile from both the listener and creator sides and weigh in on if it's worth it and, you know, what you can get out of it, what it might be getting out of you, so to speak. And again, a special message to my fellow music creators on how being an audiophile may or may not serve you and may or may not be holding you back. And I'm going to get there soon. And of course, as always, check out my bonus MxTRA video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, which I am calling The Truth About Vinyl. Everybody loves to talk about how vinyl is coming back. If you think 1 to 2% of the market is coming back, then yay vinyl. Other things about vinyl having to do with sound quality, because this is an audiophile episode. That bonus MxTRA video is going to talk about whether or not vinyl has superior sound quality and how it compares to other types of music, other formats of music. So disclaimers, if any. Again, I know a lot about this and have thought a lot about this because a part of me is an audiophile, and I'll talk about how that affects me later on. And that's really the only disclaimer. A lot of sources for this. Wikipedia, volocars.com, victrola.com, gauripriyapadam.medium.com. Thank you for the article. HiFiCenter.com, deckersons.com, us.kef.com, audiogon.com. A discussion on unbecoming an audiophile on Audiogon. How to Geek, a discussion on being an audiophile is a curse, not a blessing. And believe it or not, a Reddit discussion that I found from 12 years ago about the downsides to being an audiophile. So you may think you know where I'm going with this. You may be right. You'll find out soon. So first of all, some background. What I'm going to do is some background on general listening to music, how we got where we are, the present day, then some pros, then some cons, then some conclusions, then, of course, the featured song and questions. And that's pretty much how most of these episodes go. So thanks for joining me. So the background, the history of music listening in a nutshell, a.k.a. how we got here, of course, thousands of years of the three facets of acoustic music listening. One, our ears. People sing and play instruments and we listen, which is, of course, affected by number two, acoustics, which means the space we listen in. Indoors, it'd be the size of the room, the materials used to build the room. Outdoors, it's the sound. Is it enclosed in any way or not? Is it just open space? If it is enclosed, what's the shape of that kind of, open space enclosure, if you know what I mean? Think of Hollywood Bowl, let's say, that kind of place. Ancient amphitheaters, which were often built to maximize sound projection. The shape of the space makes a difference, which, by the way, all of this still applies today with or without electronics, except, of course, when headphones come into the mix. And number three, analog devices to amplify sound. So the speaking trumpet was used in ancient theater. There's no proof it was used for music too, but we can assume that some of that theater was sung. So music did go through the speaking trumpet. Masks with cones protruding from the mouth have been discovered as early as 5th century BC. So same thing. This is mostly for speaking, but you have to imagine some of that was sung. Speaking of the speaking trumpet, speaking, the megaphone is kind of the descendant of that. Was invented in the 17th century and eventually used for singing. Took a while, though. Think vaudeville, but likely before that, too. Keep in mind, anything like pre-microphone is what that megaphone was used for. Keep in mind that these devices could be used for both sound projection and absorption. Meaning, if you put the small end here and you do this sounds like a megaphone. If you put the small end to your ear, it's filtering sound into you from a further distance away. The name megaphone wasn't applied to the device that was invented in the 1600s until about the 1870s. In 1857, so we're getting into electronics now, a French dude invented the phonautograph, the first sound recording device. It was not really meant to be listened, just to record waves of sound, though an 1860 recording of a French folk song, Au clair de la lune, and not the Debussy, was digitally brought to life in 2008. So we get to hear what someone recorded in 1860. And this set the stage for the next development in 1877, the phonograph, using cylinders to record on. Far inferior to live sound at the time and any time, but by the early 1900s, it was selling millions of units and remained the most popular non-live way to listen to music until 1910. In 1910, what happened? So discs had been in development since the early 1880s and were being sold shortly thereafter. They eventually took over sales of cylinders by 1910. Sales of gramophone records, that's what they are, were called at the time. Normally around 78 RPM, although there wasn't a set speed at the time. It was the main format from 1910-ish until the late 1950s. Yeah. Hard, shellacked discs, easily breakable. I have actually several of those that from my parents and from their parents. It's kind of cool. Be careful with them. They will break easily. In my History of Albums series, which we're almost done, and in a couple, 3-4 weeks, final episode of that. In the first episode, I went over the history of discs, so I'm not going to go into it too much here, but a brief overview. The 33 1/3 LP vinyl was introduced in 1948. Those and 45s, singles, took over the market by the late 1950s, although 78s, the other hard discs, continued to be available through the 1960s. Cassettes came into the mix around then, ballooned in the 1970s, and eventually dominated the market briefly in the 1980s. Again, many would say cassettes are far inferior to vinyl, though I think both have their charms. I personally prefer cassettes, one for the portability, but and one because I grew up with them, and another because I like the imperfections of cassettes a little bit more than I like the imperfections of vinyl, although both are kind of cool. Then, of course, CDs came in by early 80s and took over by the late 80s, and then digital music after that, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I've done all this in other episodes and in bonus episodes. These recordings were all possible because of the invention of the microphone, also developed in the mid-1850s, around the same time as that phonautograph. While format was developing, so was how we record and listen to music, right? And the microphone played a big part of that. We talked about the gramophone. Its better version, the graphophone, came after as always an effort to improve sound from the very beginning. Eventually developed into the record player, etc. All these were mono recordings, one-track recordings. Stereo sound was actually in development from the 1880s on. It was patented in 1933, but didn't hit the mainstream until the late 1930s in movies. On tape, meaning reel-to-reel tape, on which they were recording, not until the 1940s. And that reel-to-reel tape took over from recording directly to disc, which gave more flexibility and pliability, the ability to edit, stuff like that. Stereo wasn't the standard recording mixing method until really the early 1970s. A lot of albums were released in both stereo and mono in the 1960s. Because some people had one system, some people had another, and they wanted to cater to both and sell more. But eventually that all took over. Stereo became the norm in the 70s, etc. After years and years of companies releasing both mono and stereo mixes. So home systems capable of stereo listening weren't really common till the 1960s, but like I said, they became pretty much the only option by the 70s. Radio first started. Now, so what I'm doing is an overview again of how we listen, how things are recorded, how we listen more, again, not live, because this is about, audiophiles, and audiophiles are associated with recordings, etc. Radio first started broadcasting in 1920 and quickly took off everywhere. Quick note that, though, there are other ways to send radio signals. We're most familiar with AM and FM. AM is weaker, but travels farther. FM is stronger and clearer, but doesn't have the same distance. And that's a later development. Tape recording, which I talked about briefly a minute or two ago, came about in the 1920s, became the standard way to record in studios within a couple of decades, again, rather than recording directly to disc. Multi-tracking, so 2 tracks or more, started in the late 1940s with the 2 tracks. But in 1951, Les Paul did an 8-track recording on his release How High the Moon. And eventually, studio standards grew from 2 to 4 tracks in the 60s to 8 to 16 and more through the late 60s, 70s, and then pretty much unlimited now. I mean, I remember in analog studios 24, 32, 24 was pretty common. And then, of course, digital hit. And, there are tracks I've recorded that have had, or, songs I've recorded that have had 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70 tracks. Magnetic tape recording, which is what we're talking about, took a huge leap when Dolby noise reduction was introduced in 1966. This helps get rid of the hiss that happens when you record. It happens on all formats, at least prior to that. I've gone over digital sound recording before in a bonus MxTRA video on patreon.com/music is not a genre. If you're into the history of digital music formats and how long that history is, you want to find out some surprises, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre and find that bonus MxTRA video. What I'm going to just say here is that, right, it had been in development since the 1930s, became viable in the 70s, commercial in the 1980s, heavily in the mix, pun intended, in the 1990s, and then all but fully took over from magnetic tape recording by the 2000s. DAWs, digital audio workstations, what most people record on now, though some retros and purists still prefer tape recording, even though the end result is almost always rendered digitally anyway. There's something that they like about that. The people who stock their studios with retro equipment, etc., etc. While all this was going on, consumer options for how to listen also progressed. So the gramophone with the horn, and then the first loudspeaker was actually in a phone, a telephone, as early as 1861. But it was made just for that. That developed for things like other telephones, radio, movie theaters, PA systems through the decades. Hornless speakers hit in 1921 and more or less overtook the market from the horns within about 10 years. The first full range speaker, which is one speaker covering all the frequencies, hit in the late 1950s. Woofers which are the big, if you ever see an average speaker has 2 cones, right? 2 circles, the cones where sound comes out of. Not that different in technology from a horn, frankly. Just different materials and how it's, the cabinet and how it's packaged and all that stuff. Woofers are the big ones for the low-end sounds and some of the mids. They were invented in the 1930s. Subwoofers, which is a separate device when people want even more bass. You hear that in the trunks of people's cars a lot, or certainly people who have home stereo systems and want more bass. If you ever go to a club and a DJ is spinning, there's a good chance there are many subwoofers there. They're standalone units that enhanced the bass, of course, and they came about in the 1960s. Tweeters, which are the smaller speakers that get the highs and some of the upper mids, came about in the late 1950s. So you ended up having speakers with the 2 kind of tweeter, woofer and tweeter is pretty standard. And those speakers were used in movie theaters as early as the 1940s, but didn't really hit the home market until the 1960s. And then you had 4-way speakers hit in the late 1970s, just quadraphonic sound. It started in the late 1960s, but spread more again by the late 1970s. Became more widely available in the mid-1980s, especially with the advent of Dolby 5.1. In the late 80s, in the early 90s was followed... the late 90s was followed by 6.1, 7.1 in the 2000s, Dolby Atmos in the 2010s. There's all these developments adding more speakers, more surround sound. And let's not forget binaural, which was discussed as early as the early 1800s. It started in 1881 with headphones, binaural too, and developed through the decades into this almost mystical version of listening that attempts to replicate surround sound or 360 sound using only 2 speakers or more commonly headphones. So again, keep all this in mind because a lot of this has to do with the choices audiophiles make. It's important because we mostly listen in headphones now. Or if not, I'll talk about other devices. Headphones were invented in the 1880s and have been in use in homes since 1895, but mostly for the rich or people in audio fields. The first two cans, they were always two, of course, but they often look like a stethoscope. You held up, put it on your ears. But two cans over the head like that, invented in 1910 for the Navy. And the first affordable headphones popped out in around 1937. The first stereo headphones in 1958. Every development since then, including the Walkman-style thin portable ones in 1979, in-ears with the wire in 1980s, wireless except for the connecting wire in around 2004, and then wireless earbuds by 2015. They're all basically an offshoot of the original, headphones with that stereo development. Sonic improvements here and there, like better bass, better overall fidelity, etc. Which brings us to the current state of things. And the sum of all of this is we've been working on improvements in sound capture and transmission forever. Really, pretty much forever. As with all technology, that effort ramped up by the time you hit the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, etc. But even prior to that, before electric, there was always somebody trying to work on enhancing people's ability to hear things or project things. And despite massive leaps forward, we've never found perfection. Spoiler alert, it doesn't exist. The improvements are wonderful, though. I mean, I love improvements in, like 4K for video and all that, or 8K, whatever. There are so many options and ways to listen that, like music and art itself, it's a matter of personal preference. So, again, if you're an audiophile, you care more about the certain subtleties that other people either don't hear or don't care about. Yet with all these options, many available to the average consumer, we almost always default to the worst ways of listening, quote unquote, crappy headphones or tiny, tinny speakers like on Alexa or things like that. I've listened to a lot of music when I'm cooking dinner on my Alexa, frankly, which has almost no bass. Or the phone speaker itself. I listen to a lot of music just on my phone when I don't have headphones. I'm just sitting at home. I want to play something or reference something. We pretty much also never listen in optimal settings. Where do you listen to music? Do you have everything set up in a way where the sound bounces in just the right way, that it's the perfect representation of what's on the recording? Do you have the best headphones, whatever? No. Nor do we usually bother with or understand EQ and how equalization, so changing the lows, the mids, the highs, and all of that to get the right mix to where it sounds the way you want it to sound. And everybody's ears are different, so that could be different. I do more EQing, frankly, other than recording, which I do a lot of. I do more EQing in the car than anywhere else, especially because I'm renting cars now, and each one has a different setup, so I have to mess with it if there's too much bass or not enough mid or high or whatever, because it changes based on the system. It changes based on the environment. So something that sounds amazing on, let's say, nice computer monitors, speakers, might sound like junk on an Echo. Something that is made to sound like great on just phone speakers or an Echo or some crappy device might not sound great on bigger speakers. This is a lot like how we went from getting bigger and bigger screens, and I have a 65-inch screen, so I'm a culprit there, to watching movies on our phones, which a lot of directors hate, but I get it's convenient and you still absorb it. We went from, in sound, the best we could do, biggest speakers, from boom boxes to giant home speakers and all that stuff, to surround. I once bought a system that had 5 or 7 speakers and put them in the right spots in the, blah, 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 and all of that. Increasingly better through the 1900s and early 2000s. The second half of that decade, things started to develop where we got increasingly crappier options, despite more improvements this century. And those are the options we tend to listen on. And I think this is a perfect time to take a break. Now that you've gotten the history of how we listen, how all that developed, and the current state of things, mainly the fact that we tend to opt for crappier listening and don't care about the environment and stuff like that. Keep all of that in mind, because that will all feed into the next section of this podcast, which is about the pros and cons of being an audiophile. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a minute. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. All right, we are back. Thanks for hanging for that mid-roll. I'm kind of a one-person operation right now for reasons I'm not going to go into here. And so last week, under pressure of an insane schedule, when I recorded the episode on Oasis, I, blanked. Something happened to the second half of the podcast, and I didn't record sound optimally. I am now staring at my DAW and seeing that sound is being recorded because I want to bring you the best sound I can and the best everything I can. And yay me for not screwing it up this time. So, the pros of being an audiophile. It's very important because both from the listener and creator sides, there are benefits. But first, before we do that, we've been talking about how we listen, etc. What is an audiophile? So according to Wikipedia, it's someone enthusiastic about high-fidelity sound reproduction. High fidelity can be shortened to hi-fi. Someone desiring the highest possible audio quality at every stage of recorded music. Stages being recording, the performance, the production, the mixing and mastering, the format you listen on, the system you listen on, and the environment, and your ears. But you can't often do much about that. On the listener side, audiophiles often want the best equipment, top to bottom. The instruments, the amps, the recording equipment, what they consider the best format. Lately, this term, I'm so sorry, but that's on the listener side, right? So yeah, I don't know why I defaulted to creator side because I'm a creator and I'm thinking that way. So let's go back, rewind. I'm not editing this. Listener audiophiles want the best equipment, meaning stereo systems. Whether you're into 5.1, 7. Whatever it is, the best speakers, the ones that are top rated and all that, they have an EQ, they have all the things that you want to, maybe preamp, maybe a subwoofer, I don't know. Also, what they consider the best format, which lately audiophiles are most associated with vinyl, but not all audiophiles prefer that. It's a small subset, actually, just as vinyl is a microscopic subset of the current listening formats and sales. And again, I will talk about the truth about vinyl in the bonus MxTRA video at patreon.com/music is not a genre. Listeners also prefer the music to have been recorded in optimal conditions, the best studio with the best equipment, which brings me to the creator side. Audiophile creators look for purity of sound capture, top shelf equipment, from the instruments to the mics and amps to the recording system, no hiss, no extraneous or unwanted sound, an ideal mix, preferably surround sound or similar, and a master that ideally reflects the performances and desired outcome. That's what audiophiles are. Now, some pros to being an audiophile. It's important to care about quality. It just is. I'm not someone, as punk as I am, and I have been accused of being punk, and I accept that in many ways, even though not all my music sounds like that. I still believe that there needs to be a base level of quality. For the listener, you should be able to hear as many layers of a song as possible and as close to the full audible EQ spectrum as you can, preferably in an environment with few or no background noise and little or no acoustic compromises like echo or sound being swallowed by high ceilings, etc., or you just want your headphones to work well and have a good balance in there. From the creator side, it's good to have a base standard level of recording, meaning have working equipment, a good enough mic, solid cables, proper record levels, don't peak, instruments and vocals on pitch, or close enough, a DAW, a digital audio workstation that serves you well, that you can use easily, as well as some consumable goal in mind when mixing and mastering, meaning trying to get the song to sound like what you hear in your head so others will hear the same thing and enjoy it the way you want them to and absorb it the way you want them to. And of course, performing, singing and the instruments and all that is vital too. So these are some big pros to being an audiophile for creators. Other pros for listeners: you're going to hear subtleties, nuances, layers that others won't. Sometimes you might feel more immersed in the music because of the way the sound surrounds you. You might be able to better shut out other stimuli. Close your eyes and just listen. Just funny story. I once did that. I mean, I've done it often, but in college, sophomore year, roommates, I'm sitting in front of my stereo wanting to listen to an album and figure I'll put my headphones on because it was like midnight and I didn't want to wake anybody up. There's a little button that you had to push to make the sound go just into the headphones, and I forgot to push that, and I cranked the sound in my headphones. It also cranked in speakers and woke everybody up. And even though they weren't pissed, they were a little upset. They realized they made a mistake. There was a part of me that I kind of enjoyed it. I don't know. I know that's sick. Anyway, you're better able as a listener to get a closer experience to what the creators intended with better equipment. You are satisfied as a person. So there's some other pros. Other pros for creators: you're getting the most out of every aspect of recording. So no part of it goes to waste. You're recreating your inner sound with as few barriers as possible. You're giving the listener the best possible experience. Your end result can translate to multiple formats and systems and environments. That's just true when you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a recording. It translates better across multiple formats. Not always. There are times where things still sound like crap no matter how much money you put into them because of the system you're on or whatever. Now, the interesting point here, before we get to cons, and we're getting there relatively soon, not all audiophiles are created equal. Like any group, there's a spectrum. So to say you're an audiophile and that means you believe this or whatever else it is it's bull, right? And there are people who are staunch about it and people who aren't. And so I have created kind of a tiers from the lightest possible audiophile to the heaviest. So number one, you understand what good audio is compared to other options, but don't care enough to replicate it. You're aware of it, so that's the audiophile part of you, but you don't care enough to really buy the equipment or have optimal conditions or care about format or whatever. Number two is you prefer the highest quality available to you, and you do your best to get that, but you'll listen in other ways in a pinch. So you might have a system that you like and you've set it up in a way that's how you like to listen to music, or you have the best headphones, whatever. But if you're somewhere else, you're at a party, you're at some club or something like that, or someone wants you to hear things on their headphones, you're not going to scoff at that. You're going to be like, all right, that's cool. Just a different listening experience. Number three, getting a little heavier, you'll only listen to what you think of as top-notch reproduction on every level. But you understand why others don't, and you're okay with that. So you're restricting your listening experience by saying, I'm only going to listen to the stuff that was recorded in the best way on the format I prefer, in the system and in the environment, etc. And that's all you ever listen to if you can filter out everything else. But you understand why other people aren't that way, and you're like, cool, that's you're not as important to you. And then the fourth and heaviest is you refuse to listen to anything but what you see as the perfect format on the perfect system, etc. And don't respect or understand people who don't care the way you do. Which, of course, in any group of people, if that's where you are on the spectrum, you're an asshole. Go back to season 7, episode 1. If you're the person who believes that only good music, the only good music was made when you were a teenager or 20s or whatever it is, and you don't understand why people could like music after that period, you're an asshole, right? And I'm just saying that as a point of fact, because you are taking an opinion and imposing that opinion on others as a judgment. Right, because the first three are cool by me. As much as I don't go so far as to be that third one where I'll only listen to music and honestly can't afford even to be the second one because I just can't buy the equipment. And really it makes me that first one because I don't care enough to buy the equipment. I like listening on great speakers or with great headphones. That's fine. But my enjoyment of music is not diminished because I listen on my phone speakers or Alexa or whatever else it is, because, and I'll tell you why that's the case later, but all those, they're cool because they allow for other people's opinions and experiences, right? And I talked about the last one, right? And then that is a perfect segue into what are the cons of being an audiophile. The number one, and the biggest con, because music is about experiencing art, right, is that your options are severely limited. And I'd say that despite possible sound quality being better than ever, meaning the ability for us to achieve the highest quality sound is better than it's ever been, and it's always getting better, there's actually a vastly smaller percentage of optimal listening conditions on every level because crappy systems, phones, whatever, are so ubiquitous. And the recording process, so there's four things. I've been talking about these four things. Let me delineate them just so you're aware and you can go back and listen or however you want to do it. I'm judging based on the recording process, the format it's listened on, the system it's listened on, and the environment. Those are the four criteria for how things are set up to be optimal for an audiophile or not, or however you want to do it. This is how we listen. We listen to things that are recorded in a certain format, usually streaming these days, on a certain system, wherever you are, whatever your preference is, in a certain environment, right? And most of those conditions, all four of them, are suboptimal and have been throughout history, but I think more than ever before because crappy listening systems are cheap or we default to things that weren't meant for strictly music, like phones. While some new music is being made on analog systems for formats like vinyl, cassettes, most of it is recorded digitally and is intended for streaming. So this further limits an audiophile's options. This is another con, because if you're the kind of person that's like, I want the best possible quality, you're not going to listen to streaming. So millions, hundreds of millions of songs, whatever it is, are not available to you. Also, yeah, you need to spend a lot of money, far more than the average listener, more on your desired format, more on the sound system, more on setting up the space you listen in. You might want sound absorption on the walls or whatever it is. You are spending way more money than, frankly, you need to, whether it's for your home or your car or hundreds or thousands of dollars on headphones that honestly only give you a minor improvement in sound from other headphones. Another con, your enjoyment of music on the whole is severely diminished because most of what you'll hear throughout your days will be subpar in your estimation. Unless you work from home and never go out. And even then, if you do, and you're watching TV or listening or a movie or something like that, but if you do go out, store, someone else's place, whatever it is, a restaurant, most of what you're hearing isn't up to your standards. So you're not getting that enjoyment out of it. Honestly, your enjoyment of music is severely diminished entirely, being a staunch audiophile. Another con, you prefer artists' recordings that were done optimally. So you care, and this is the thing, you may have preferences. You may, everyone, judges good, bad music, whatever. There's no standard there. I never claim to know what that standard is. I have my preferences. The only time I, again, call people out is when they think they know better than other people, right? But you only prefer artists' recordings that were done, the best system, with the most money thrown at it, best equipment in the best recording studio, etc., even maybe with the best musicians. And often you prefer this even if the material is frankly subpar. So there might be some artist out there who's doing the same kind of music, writing better songs, performing better, all of that. But you care more about the sound than the music itself. And I'm going to talk more about that in the conclusions. Your interest is not as much in the actual music as you may claim it is. It's on the sound quality of it, which severely limits your options and makes you judgy, meaning you turn on that part of your brain that's judging what you're listening to instead of just experiencing it, right? Another con, you're partly responsible for the loudness wars. Let's be honest. So that was an attempt to optimize or maximize the volume aspect of recordings in the 2000s and into the 2010s that went too far. And things got so heavily compressed that when you look at the waveform, it's almost like just a big, thick line as opposed to having the peaks and valleys of a normal recording. I fell prey to it. There are some recordings I did that were just way too compressed. And I'm honestly, it's hurt a lot of people, musicians in particular, because many of us are still haunted by our songs being of lower volume on streaming than others. And a lot of that has to do with two things: how you record, how much money you're able to throw into it, right? And the streaming service itself has an algorithm that normalizes the volume so that all of the songs are in the same general range. And when it does that, it compresses them, and it compresses them in a way that may affect your volume. And I've often tried to get around that. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But the fact that it haunts any of us is ridiculous, and it is the fault of the streamers, streaming services, and not of our music in any way. And I say this because if you were alive in the 70s or 80s or even the 90s, and you were listening to varying recordings, let's say you had, like my dad did, a turntable where you could stack LPs, and then one would play, and when that was done, the next one would drop, and the next one would play. It's almost like a, multi-disc CD player or whatever. I guarantee you the volume levels on those are going to be variable. So what did you do? You turn the sound up or down. That was just part of the experience. When you're a DJ, and I DJ'd a lot, if one 12-inch was quieter than another, you boosted the volume before you mixed it in. That kind of standard, RIAA, Recording Industry Association, whatever it is, which has tried its best to normalize sound from long before digital, doesn't exist. And so even when you're listening on streaming services, you're going to hear a lot of older recordings that haven't been remastered, that don't live up to the so-called volume standards of other newer recordings. So you shouldn't judge yourself that way. Another con of being an audiophile, you're imperious, you're a know-it-all, you're harder to hang with in social music settings. It's a way for you to feel superior, which is isolating to you, right? Another con, you kill your own experience. And I said this before, but let me flesh it out. Part of you is always dissecting the listening experience, especially if you haven't set it up. But even if you have set up the experience, you chose all the equipment, whatever. And worse, you're dissecting the music. Does the bass have enough bottom? Are the mids too muddy? Are the highs too tinny? Is the separation of tracks too little or too much? Is the guitar tone perfect? Were the drums mic'd properly? Are the vocals perfectly pitched? Or whatever else bothers you, etc., etc. Your hyper-awareness has turned you from a listener to a critic. And this is not just for listeners. It's for creators too. We pick apart our recordings in ways that make us reluctant to release them or embarrassed because they're not perfect, and they never will be, and you gotta let them out into the world. I'll talk more about that later. Another con of being an audiophile, you discount the fact that most people's ears themselves are not optimal listening devices. Ear damage, age, variations we all have, other conditions, and yet most people enjoy listening to music regardless of those changes. One last word on cons before we get to conclusions. It's a little like the difference between a natural high and a drug high. Both can have the same effect, right? But the drug high by nature happens less frequently, requires more control because you need the right things and a safe space to get there. It does more damage, is more isolating, and ultimately doesn't last. While the natural high might take more effort to be tuned in, it also requires a letting go, a surrendering to the moment, accepting what is. It is so healthy to do. It can be achieved more frequently because it ultimately doesn't matter where you are, what the conditions are. the equipment and needs no additional equipment to get there. Yeah. There's more opportunity for spontaneous joy. So as an audiophile, quite a lot less. You know where I come down on this. Conclusions. I want you to think of all the songs you've loved throughout all the decades. How many of those songs were recorded optimally? So let's say you became an audiophile in your 20s, like happens to a lot of people, maybe sooner, maybe later. There are songs you knew when you were a kid that were recorded what you would consider now suboptimally, but you still love them because they sank into you before you became this audiophile, right? How many of those when you were a kid did you listen to on an amazing system in a perfect setting or in the format you preferred? Probably almost zero or very few. Did any of that affect your loving the music? Do you still love those songs or artists? You do? Then you're maybe not the audiophile you think, right? You're denying yourself pleasure if it did affect your listening experience. If it didn't, right, you have tons of qualifications to being an audiophile. Well, I love that song because I grew up with it and it's incredible. Every time I hear it, it makes me feel things. Or I love that band because it's my kind of music. So it doesn't matter that it wasn't recorded optimally. You know, you're going to have all these qualifications that basically disprove your own theory that being an audiophile is a good thing. And guaranteed, in both cases, part or all of that music was neither recorded nor listened to optimally, right? And by the way, if you're not an audiophile, or if you're like number 1 or 2 on that hierarchy, you're not missing much. And I get into that in the bonus MxTRA video at patreon.com/music is not a genre to judge the truth about vinyl and, you know, get into some facts and figures and data about why that's true. It's like never getting to go to the movies. Sure, I love the movie experience in a theater, but I'm still enjoying tons of movies at home. I'm not going to stop enjoying movies at home or even on my laptop or whatever it is and not on a big screen because I can't afford to go to the movies all the time or whatever it is, or I don't have the time to. There's also a very high chance that you as a non-audiophile would barely hear the so-called amazing difference audiophiles talk about. In fact, studies have been done where very, very few people can hear, oh my God, do you hear this extra? Because a lot of it has to do with attention anyway. If you pay enough attention, you're going to hear that stuff even if you're not on an optimal system, right? Or you might hear it, the difference, and be like, oh yeah, it's a little bit better, and then shrug and never have any need to reproduce the experience because that part's not important to you. Audiophiles might claim that they respect music more because they only want the absolute best for it. The same can be said of eugenicists and white supremacists. Now, I'm not saying that there's probably crossover, but I'm not saying it's a one-to-one. Of course not. Those are serious things. But what I am saying is the underlying attitude is the same, which is only the best matters. And that sucks. And the truth is, you don't really respect music. Because if you did, you'd love it no matter what, flaws and all. Also, keep in mind that just about zero live experiences are optimal. So how can you be an audiophile and also love live music? I'm sure you have your qualifications as well. And so what I mean by ear glamour, to reiterate, you care more about the sound than the music. The sound is the metaphorical appearance, and the music is the substance. And you care more about the sound than the substance. You can't overlook a lack of perfection, which doesn't exist anyway, enough to allow yourself to enjoy any and all music that fits what you're into. You end up missing out on an array of sublime, subtle, nuanced, quirky, offbeat, left field, indie, often music that wasn't recorded perfectly, hasn't been reproduced ideally, and can't be listened to optimally. You're missing out on all of that because you're prejudging based on your audiophile qualifications, which, by the way, there is no superior format. Each has pros and cons. And I talk about that again in the bonus MxTRA video, The Truth About Vinyl, patreon.com/music is not a genre. Final word on listener audiophiles. You're like those people who need the most pristine and highest end car and spend a lot less time enjoying just getting from point A to point B, the journey, and a lot more time obsessing over gear. Similar to music gearheads, which I can't stand. When you're somebody who's like, I can only play this guitar in this setting. I had somebody buy me a bass because they didn't like the sound of my bass. It was slightly too trebly or something like that. And I'm like, dude, back off, you know. If you're a music creator and you are sitting on music, this is a special message to you. If you're sitting on music you've written and maybe even recorded, in part or in whole, and you're refusing to release it because you're afraid or concerned that it doesn't rise to some standard in your head, or you don't have the right setting or instruments or equipment, meaning the money, which you now have to fundraise by asking fans and friends and family to pony up for you, then you're doing yourself and the world a disservice. Pretty much every wise person in every field, all the arts, business, etc., has said at one point or another a version of publish or perish. Content is king. Done is better than perfect, etc., etc. Meaning, put shit out. The sooner, the better. Stop waiting. Stop asking people for money. Just frickin' record it the best way you possibly can in the conditions available to you and get it out. People want to hear your music. People will love it. Some people will love it. And you'll never know that if you're sitting on it. If the quality of creation meets your standards, if you like your song, if you like how you performed it, then again, perfect is the enemy of done. Don't be your own critic. Find a way to do it that doesn't delay, doesn't overly tax yourself, your own pocket, your fans, your friends, your family. Doesn't make people wait so long. You're sitting on it, by the way, not because it hasn't achieved audiophile level. You may think that's the case. You're using that as an excuse. It's really because you're insecure about the music and you're afraid it will be harshly judged. You know how many times I've released a song or a full album where I was like, oh, shit, that mix wasn't perfect. But it was so damn close. Anybody else I played it for was like, I can't hear what you're talking about. And I released it and it's out in the world and there are people enjoying it. I have felt all these things. I have harshly judged myself for the way I record, for not having the money. But it's never stopped me from enjoying not just all my listening experience, but everything that I record, from enjoying putting out the music into the world. Which brings me to my final and more personal conclusion. Truth is, I'm never satisfied with my audio quality. That audiophile in me is always judging, no matter how much time and work and sometimes money I put into it, though very seldom money. I've recorded in all kinds of places and situations, low-end studios, mid and high-level studios, professional home setups, 4-tracks, DAWs. Each has their benefits. Each has had their fans, my music-wise. Some people liked stuff I did that was super professional, and some people liked the, homegrown stuff. Would I love to record in an ideal setting all the time? Sure. Though I'd still record at home anyway. Will that stop me from recording and releasing everything I want to? Hell no. I'm that low-end number one audiophile who very well knows the difference in quality from recording to listening system to environment, all of it, but don't care enough to let that stop me from enjoying good music done well, mine and everyone else's. Which brings me to the featured song for the week. It's a brand new single. It's the last single pre-release before the album, my band Rex album, KITE to Camden, comes out on November 8th, only on Bandcamp. So pretty soon after this episode, I just released this week the single, The Mad Philosopher. Now, there will be more singles next year, by the way, most likely, once the album comes out and goes from Bandcamp to streaming and all that stuff. But I have some label interest, so I don't want to stream it until I understand if that label's interested, what they would do with it, right? It's going to be, but the single, The Mad Philosopher, that is the featured song, is going to be released everywhere. It's by the time you see this. Or if not, very soon. October 28th, 2024 is the release date. So 6 years ago, I wrote 2 love songs for a new love, who person's now my wife. All Kinds of Right, which was on the album, 2 versions of it, Synergy for the Weird from 2020. And then this song, which originally called The Mad Monk. Didn't work out because I didn't want that association with Rasputin, But I changed the Mad Philosopher and I changed certain words in there, etc., etc. Mad Man instead of Mad Monk. And what the lyrics mean is a metaphor, okay? A guy in a cave isolating himself, trying to find answers to the world and ignoring the fact that if you just go out into the world and experience it, you either will find the answers easier or you may not need the answers at all. And then by the end of the song, which stick around, you'll hear soon, you find out whether or not the guy decides to leave the cave. But it's a love song, so, I might have spoiled it already. By the way, it's the final song on the album, and it comes in the sequence in a way that is as epic as the rest of the album itself. I'm just going to say it because it's true. Questions for you. Are you an audiophile? If so, are you able to enjoy music that doesn't meet your standards? Like, which are you? 1, 2, 3, or 4? You're not an audiophile, does it bother you at all when music doesn't sound as good as it could? Sometimes that does bother me, but less often than not, because I just enjoy the song or the composition itself, the performance itself. I want to know the answers to all these questions because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you so much for hanging with me, and get ready for a couple of very special episodes coming up in the next couple of weeks. Talk to you soon.
The madman says don't leave the cave. Time keeps passing by. Twice a day the sun hits my face. Makes me wanna sigh, cry, die, fly. Why do you care what I do when I'm not even there? Is this what philosophers see from above? Is this what it feels like to fall in love? Twice a day the sun hits my face. Doesn't feel warm to me. The madman says stay in the cave. Who is he? And doesn't he see you like a light with the sun in your hair saying hey, it's alright? Philosophers can't see it all from above. I know what it feels like to fall in love. In love. Oh, love, your soul is the sound. That don't mean I won't crawl to the comfort I found. But there's you just outside on the sunlit ground. You pull me up and you spin me right round, baby, right round. Is this what philosophers see from above? Is this what they think when they're thinking too much? Is this what they miss in their cave of enough? Is this what they feel when they can't feel the love? Is this what they see with their weary mind's eyes? Is this who I am in my fearful disguise? Do we talk and think and dream and hide and squirm and push and shove away from the sun, away from the love? Is it me? I'm the madman philosopher. Oh, I push past the cobwebs, I've seen through the bluff. I step out and over the cliff high above. This is what it feels like to fall in love. In love. The madman stepped out of his cave when he saw you.